For far too long, Vladimir Putin has been convinced that Russia will win the Ukraine war. It was meant to happen quickly, but it didn't. Russia was supposed to attrit Ukraine, but hasn't. Now a win in Putin's eyes would be convincing Ukraine to cede territory in Donbas to Russia. It's not all that Putin wanted, and if Finland has anything to say about it, Russia's president won't even be getting that. Finland has delivered a double slap to Putin with a sharp message that lets the Russian leader know that his authority will never be officially recognized. The Kremlin has been shaken to its core, but Putin may still have a lifeline in US President Donald Trump. On October 18th, BBC reported on several comments made by Finnish President Alexander Stubb, who was interviewed on BBC Radio 4's Today broadcast. Stubb said in no unclear terms that there will be no time in the future when Finland recognizes Crimea as part of Russia. The peninsula, which Putin annexed in 2014, has been occupied by Russia for over a decade. That doesn't matter to Stubb. Ever since the Crimean annexation, Finland has been relying less and less on Russia as a trade partner, says the Centre for European Reform, or CER. It shares an interesting chart showing that about 18% of Finland's imports came from Russia in 2012. By 2015, which is a year after the annexation of Crimea, those imports were down to about 11%. And though they rose as high as 14% in the years that followed, the imports dropped to a low point of 8% in 2022, which is when Putin invaded Ukraine. Finland has been showing Russia that it means business with these trade decreases for over a decade. Now, Stubb has put into words what Finland's actions have demonstrated. But it's not just Crimea that was on Stubb's mind on October 17th. In addition to discussing how Finland would never recognize the Russian occupation of that peninsula, Stubb added that the same goes for any region that Russia tries to claim as a result of the Ukraine invasion. Stubb made particular mention of the Luhansk and Donetsk regions in Donbas. Russia currently occupies around 70% of the latter and almost all of the former, the BBC reports. But invasion does not equal ownership, according to Finland's president. The only ones who can decide on the land issue are the Ukrainians themselves, Stubb said in a pointed message directed at Putin. This is not Russia's land to take, Stubb is saying, and it doesn't matter how much Putin wants to pretend that it is. Russia's leader is desperate to get his hands on as much of the Donbas as possible. Al Jazeera explained a few of the reasons why in an August 19th article, noting that the Donbas offers strategic, economic, and symbolic benefits to the Kremlin. On the economic side, the outlet quotes the Center for Strategic and International Studies' Mark F. Kantsian, who says, "The Donbas was highly industrialized in the mid-20th century, though it became something of a rust belt after the Cold War." Kantsian adds that the region's farmland is some of the best in the world. So Putin may be looking at reinventing the industrialized Donbas of the Soviet era, while taking advantage of the region being a breadbasket for much of Europe. However, there is another economic factor at play here: minerals. Donbas has reserves of a lot of precious metals and minerals that Putin would love to profit from. Right now, Al Jazeera reports, Russia is already sitting on about 40% of Ukraine's metal resources. Donetsk is also home to the Shevchenko field of lithium ores, which is located in a rural settlement and is one of Ukraine's largest lithium deposits. The Economic Times adds that Donbas contains about 56% of Ukraine's hard coal reserves, which the outlet claims are worth about $12 trillion. That adds to the $12.5 trillion of mineral and gas assets upon which the Russian occupiers now sit in Ukraine. There's a lot of money to be made in Donbas, and Putin sees this figurative gold mine as a great way to right Russia's economic ship after the Ukraine war is over. On the strategic side, Al Jazeera says the port in Mariupol, which Russia also occupies, offers year-round access to the Black Sea. That access, when combined with the passage into the Black Sea that annexed Crimea already offers, would allow Russia to essentially control the Black Sea, should it be able to position more of its navy there. But perhaps more important than all of this, Al Jazeera says, it's the symbolic aspect of Donbas that most appeals to Putin. The region is home to many native Russian speakers. In Donetsk alone, almost 75% of the people use Russian in their homes, with the figure in Luhansk being 68.8%. That's a result of many Russians moving to the Donbas during the Soviet era, and it's this that Putin uses as so-called evidence that the region should belong to Russia. Eric Heron, who is a political scientist with West Virginia University, tells Al Jazeera, Russia has made many unsubstantiated claims about the treatment of Russian speakers there by the Ukrainian government. Donbas is symbolically central to Russia's story about why the war is happening. That symbolism is a strong influencing factor. If Ukraine were to cede Donbas to Russia, Putin will be able to parade around acting as though his justifications for the Ukraine invasion were legitimate. As for Ukraine, it will be left with Russia being far closer and having a much longer border with Ukraine than ever before. In other words, Putin might be happy to settle for Donbas today, but once Russia has built up a strong enough presence in the region, the rest of Ukraine will be back in Putin's crosshairs. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has repeatedly stated that he won't hand Donbas over to Russia in exchange for peace. Now, Stubb has thrown his hat into the ring. With just a few words, Finland's president has told Putin that any annexation of the Donbas that isn't entirely Ukraine's decision will be met with the Finnish cry of illegitimacy. It will never be accepted, and that means Putin won't be able to use his control over the region to ingratiate himself with Finland, or as seems likely, the rest of Western Europe. That was Stubb's first slap to Putin's face. As Russia's leader attempted to right himself, figuratively rubbing a Finnish handprint in an attempt to soothe the sting, Stubb delivered a second slap to the other cheek. Ukraine must join the European Union, or EU, and ideally, NATO. I want to make sure that Ukraine, when this war is over, retains its independence, retains its sovereignty. In other words, becomes an EU member state and hopefully a NATO member, and also maintains its territorial integrity. Euromaidan Press reports Stubb as saying, "That is what we're all fighting for right now." Ukraine joining the EU may not have much of an impact on Putin, at least if the man himself is to be believed. In September, Russia's leader tried to claim that he never had any issue with Ukraine joining the EU, according to DW. The outlet points out that Russia has never officially opposed Ukraine's desire to join the EU. Putin said the same thing during a September visit to China, stating, "As for Ukraine's membership of the EU, we have never objected to this," before adding, "As for NATO, this is another issue." In other words, Russia seems to be saying fine to EU membership, but no to NATO. Stubb wants both for Ukraine, and Putin's comments about EU membership could also be disingenuous. Though it's true that Russia has never officially opposed Ukraine's attempts to join the EU, and that it would not be able to as a non-member, it's also important to remember the goal of Russia's supposed special military operation. There's a reason why the early days of the invasion saw Russia trying to penetrate Kyiv. Putin believes that Ukraine shouldn't exist as a sovereign nation. Perhaps Putin never lodged any official complaint about Ukraine's desired EU membership because he thought the country would be under Russia's control before any of that mattered. Ukraine isn't under Russian control. Now Putin seems to be trying to use EU membership as a way to get what he wants out of Ukraine right now: Donbas. Returning to Stubb's comments, there are now two questions to ask. Will Ukraine be able to join the EU, and will it eventually join NATO? The EU question is the far easier of the two to answer, as Ukraine has applied and is currently in negotiations with the EU for its membership. Accession negotiations were greenlit by the EU in December 2023, and the EU officially opened those negotiations about 6 months later. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was also quick to point out that the EU would be more than happy to welcome Ukraine into the fold. "Europe is in the eyes of all Ukrainians who fight for a better future, and together we can win this fight. Together we can complete our union. Together we can bring Ukraine in our common European home. This is the dream of Ukraine's heroes and Ukraine's martyrs, and it's our dream too. Together we are Europe," von der Leyen has said of Ukraine's desired EU membership. In February, von der Leyen added that Ukraine is on track to join the EU before the decade is through. "I really appreciate the political will that is there. I would even say Ukraine's merit-based process, if they continue at that speed and at that quality, perhaps they could be earlier than 2030, the European Commission President claimed. Hold on a second. 2030? That's a long way for Ukraine's EU membership, which could raise some questions as to whether the EU is actually serious about welcoming Ukraine into the bloc. Those questions are dispelled when you realize that the EU is a very bureaucratic organization, and the 6 years from when Ukraine applied to the end of 2029 is actually pretty fast-tracked when it comes to EU membership. As the Pew Research Center notes, the average time from EU application to official membership is about 9 years, so Ukraine will be 3 years ahead of the curve. Ukraine's EU membership, though not exactly a given, seems very likely. The country's prospective NATO membership, which Stubb says he and Finland support, is far less certain. Putin has objected to this possibility many times in the past, and he's not the only one. On August 18th, ahead of a meeting with Zelensky at the White House, Trump said that Ukraine's president could end the Ukraine war if he wants to. However, there would be no going into NATO by Ukraine, included as part of any peace deal. This seems to be Trump communicating to everybody that Putin has made it clear that Ukraine's NATO membership is a deal breaker for Russia. Trump saying these things is a major problem for Ukraine. After all, the US is rightfully the major power player in NATO thanks to its enormous military budget, its ties to the rest of NATO members, and the 5,225 nuclear weapons that the Arms Control Association claims the US has in its stockpiles. Writing for the Cato Institute in March, Doug Bandow highlighted that Ukraine has received a no from successive US presidents. Trump's latest refusal might be the most recent, but both Joe Biden and Barack Obama have refused to consider Ukraine entering NATO. Interestingly, Bandow notes that former President George W. Bush was a proponent of Ukraine's NATO membership, though he adds that Bush's support may have been the problem that triggered everything we've seen in Ukraine over the past 2 decades. The transatlantic alliance's resulting promise to include Kyiv, made at Bush's behest at the 2008 Bucharest NATO summit, was an essential factor in Moscow's decision for war nearly 14 years later, Bandow writes. It's clear why Ukraine wants NATO membership. It hopes that this membership will deter Putin from any further aggression. If such membership were achieved as the Ukraine war rages, it would also mean that Putin faces a problem. Continuing to attack Ukraine in that scenario would trigger Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which would mean starting a war with all 32 NATO members along with Ukraine. That explains the US refusal. It doesn't want to be dragged into a direct fight with Russia, no matter how much it may seem to make sense to make Ukraine a NATO member on the grounds of its military strength and proximity to Russia. As for after the Ukraine war, that's where the complications lie. Even if we assume that Ukraine manages to defend its sovereignty and pushes Russia out of its territory, Bandow's point still stands. If Ukraine were to be granted NATO membership in the aftermath of the war, and this applies even for a version of Ukraine that has ceded Donbas, Putin would be furious. Would he be angry enough to start another Ukraine war, knowing what that would mean in the context of a Russian battle with NATO? Nobody really knows. And that's where the problem lies. But for Stubb, whose country has only joined NATO in the years since Putin invaded Ukraine, the answer to NATO's NATO question is cut and dry. By stating that Ukraine will hopefully join NATO, Stubb delivers his second Finnish slap to Putin's face. He's letting Russia know that Finland, at least, would support Ukraine joining the collective defense organization, perhaps because Stubb believes that Finland might be next. That's certainly an opinion shared by many of Stubb's country people. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation noted on October 18th, Finnish people point to their country's geography and history with Russia as the reason why they think Putin will turn his attention to them next. The latter issue in particular sees Finland share some interesting parallels with Ukraine, not least of which is the country ceding 10% of its territory to Russia as part of a peace treaty signed in the aftermath of the Winter War that Russia started against Finland in 1939. Finland knows what it feels like to lose territory to Russia. Stubb's comments suggest that his country has no intention of allowing Ukraine to feel that kind of pain, and Finland will support EU and NATO membership for Ukraine to ensure the nation's sovereignty. The double slap is complete, and the Kremlin is suitably shaken by this unsubtle showcase of Finnish support. However, there's a caveat to all of this. As good as it is for Ukraine to see that Finland backs it on everything from sovereignty to its membership in the 2 organizations that could ensure Putin never pulls anything like the Ukraine invasion again, Finland is a fairly quiet voice in the grand scheme of things. Stubb highlights that himself as he notes that Trump is the only Western leader who truly yields the power to bring Putin to the negotiating table. In his Radio 4 interview, Stubb said that he had told Trump that Putin couldn't be trusted during one of the golf games the pair of leaders have shared. Stubb adds, "What we need is not so much the power of the carrot to convince Russia to the negotiating table, it's more of the stick that will bring them," Stubb said during his interview. So you have to force Russia to come to the negotiating table for peace, and that's the deal that President Trump is trying to make. In other words, Trump can't tempt Putin into peace by acquiescing to him. Instead, it's pressure that will pay when it comes to the Ukraine war, and Trump is the only man capable of wielding the sort of pressure needed to make Putin back down. That leads us to the obvious question, will Trump help to create that pressure? It's possible. At the time of creating this video, Trump and Putin are set to meet in Hungary for what should be a discussion on peace. Interesting questions have been raised over this, including whether it's even safe for Putin to fly over the territory of the several European nations his plane has to bypass in order for him to even reach Hungary. At least Hungary is in the process of withdrawing from the International Criminal Court, or ICC. Hungary notified the United Nations about its withdrawal from the ICC in June, meaning it's under no obligation to follow through on the arrest warrant the ICC issued for Putin back in March 2023. So Putin will be safe in that respect. However, this conversation with Trump could go several ways. We already know that Trump, like Putin, says no to Ukraine's NATO membership. However, some believe that Putin is now ready to make a deal. One of those people is exiled Russian oligarch Mikhail Khodorkovsky. "I have the impression that Putin has sent Trump a signal that he's ready for a deal," Khodorkovsky said of the surprise Hungary meeting. However, he adds that he now has doubts about whether he understands what Putin wants anymore and that he has never had any idea about Trump's real goals in peace discussions. Trump may have offered a signal of what could end up being the outcome of the Hungary talks on October 19th. That's when The Independent reported on comments that Trump made to a Fox News anchor that suggest he expects Ukraine to make some form of territorial concession to bring about peace. "Well, he's going to take something," Trump said of Putin. "I mean, they fought, and he has a lot of property. I mean, he's won certain property." That comment casts a huge shadow over Stubb's slap to Putin. Finland's desire to protect Ukraine's sovereignty may not matter as much as Trump believing that the war in Ukraine could end if Ukraine cedes some territory. Donbas would be Putin's goal if Trump indicates a willingness to push Ukraine to cede, which would only lead to all of the issues we discussed earlier in the video. This isn't the stick that Stubb spoke of. It would instead be a big juicy carrot that Trump dangles in front of Putin's face. For his part, Zelensky says that the US, along with the rest of the West, should be increasing the pressure on Putin to force Russia's leader to crack. Also on October 19th, Ukraine's president urged Trump to get tougher on Putin and even indicated that he will be willing to join the Hungary summit to talk about peace directly with Putin. Zelensky likened the Ukraine situation to the one between Israel and Gaza, as he called Putin a terrorist. Putin is something similar but more strong than Hamas, Zelensky said, before noting that Russia has the world's second biggest army and that the Ukraine war is larger than the Israel-Hamas conflict. And that's why more pressure is needed to get Putin to stop, Zelensky adds. Just as Stubb says, the stick is going to be better for dealing with Putin than the carrot. Which of those two will Trump choose? We'll find out following the Hungary meeting. For now, Finland's double slap to Putin reveals that the country supports Ukraine so intently that it wants to see everything up to and including NATO membership for Ukraine. And it may not be long before Finland is joined by another powerful NATO member in making that call. Russia is doing something sinister over Germany. The shadow war is exposed in our video, so check it out to learn more. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more up-to-date coverage of the latest developments in the Ukraine war. And thank you as always for watching.